Good evening. My name is Nicola Jennings. I'm the director of the Athena Art Foundation, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this talk this evening on Edmonia Lewis, Margaret Foley, and the White Marmorean Flock. I will introduce our speakers in a minute, but first I just want to tell you something about the Athena Art Foundation if this is your first time joining us. We are a non-profit based in the UK, and we promote engagement with pre-modern art, pre-20th century art using digital platforms. We have a YouTube channel, we have Instagram, and we have a website with lots of different articles. So please do check out our other material. There will be questions at the end, and the talk is being recorded. Our first speaker is Charmaine Nelson. Charmaine is very well known, but I will introduce her nevertheless. She's Provost Professor of Art History in the Department of the History of Art and Architecture at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She's also Directory of Slavery North, an initiative that supports scholarship and research creation on Canadian slavery and slavery in the US North. She's made groundbreaking contributions to the field of visual culture, of slavery, race and representation, Black diaspora studies, and African-American, African-Canadian art history. Her many books include The Color of Stones, Sculpting the Black Female Subject in 19th Century America, and Slavery, Geography and Empire in 19th Century. Dr. Ramey Mize is an Assistant Curator of American Art at the Portland Museum of Art. She specializes in art of the Americas from the 19th century to the present day, with a focus on cultural exchange, expressions of place, and the intersections between US and Indigenous art. Her curatorial practice is dedicated to expanding the field, notably through the reinstallation project Passages in American Art, which is a new project. Before joining the PMA, Mize was the Lois and Arthur Steinman Research Assistant in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's American Wing, the Met's Douglas Foundation Fellow, and a participant in the Center for Curatorial Leadership Mellon Foundation Seminar in Curatorial Practice. Previously, she held curatorial positions at the Colby College Museum of Fine Art, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and received research grants from several prestigious bodies. So we have two fantastic speakers with us tonight. We're incredibly lucky. And I'm really going to ask Charmaine the first question. I'm going to ask her to tell us a little bit about Edmonia Lewis and the White Marmorean Flock. And then I'm going to ask Ramey to tell us a bit more about Margaret Foley, one of whose pieces they have in their collection at the Portland Museum of Art. So Charmaine, over to you.
So for me, speaking about Edmonia Lewis with any rigor and accuracy is impossible to do without understanding the moment that she was living in. So Edmonia, we believe, was born between 1843 and 45. We do not have a birth certificate, so we have not yet confirmed that. She died in 1907. She was of part Indigenous and Black ancestry. So why I point that out is because she was living in a moment before her nation abolished slavery. Right? The American, United States of America, slavery was not ended until 1865, the end of the Civil War. So Edmonia was living through a period when people like her with African ancestry were enslaved, and to be enslaved was to be chattel under the law. So we need to think about that context in which European colonization, empire building, and slavery across the Americas constituted Black Africans always as enslavable. And what that meant for Edmonia to be living in that moment with pro-slavery discourse rampant basically everywhere, but also to be living in a moment of heightened abolitionist or anti-slavery activity. And this is key for Edmonia too, because many of her early patrons were abolitionists, were white abolitionists. So I want to think about, too, the way that pseudosciences and what came to be a supposed common sense of white racial superiority proliferated this moment and how it impacted also the aesthetics of neoclassical sculpture, both in terms of their desire constantly to center white marble, and also in terms of the aesthetics of the body, which for them were considered the beautiful, which were an aesthetics around the ancient body of through a Eurocentric idea. And you can see that here demonstrated through, on the left, the pseudoscientific heads or skulls being juxtaposed with the so-called Negro or the black man in the middle, closer to this chimpanzee. And at the top, I want to point out that white man is resistant to the scientific gaze. Is not a white man that's represented, but the Apollo Belvedere that's made to stand in for white man. So when you think about sex, beauty, race, and culture around neoclassicism, we also want to think about the fact that a lot of these sculptors, not just Lewis, the white sculptors, many of them, the Americans, were abolitionists and considered themselves to be anti-slavery activists. And many of them were interested in and committed to sculpting themes about American slavery. And we have to realize part of this is that American slavery went on longer than slavery in many other areas. Brazil abolished slavery in 1888 after the United States of America, Cuba in 1886. But Britain abolished slavery 30 years earlier in 1834. And Britain, of course, included the nation that became Canada. So I want to point out, though, that when we think about the aesthetics of the body and the enslaved subject, what becomes very clear is that not just neoclassicists, but other artists at the time had different understandings of what was possible in terms of the specificity of the articulation of the Black subject, be it male or female. What I mean by that is many of the neoclassicists created enslaved females who were mixed race types, whereas the male subjects were supposedly full-blooded African. So if they think about the disparities which accrued here in terms of notions of beauty, I also want to point out when I bring you Hiram Powers' Greek Slave, that we have the hypocrisy that's coming through with white American sculptors who want to talk about American slavery but refuse to sculpt a Black female enslaved subject. So Powers' Greek Slave was understood widely as an abolitionist sculpture that was commenting on American slavery, but to do so, he sculpted a white Christian woman who was supposedly enslaved by the Turkish. And he got great praise for this, and he got great abuse for this as well, from abolitionists who thought he didn't go far enough and that he should have been sculpting a Black female subject. Okay, and here's some of the kind of direct popular culture criticism that came through with a journal like Punch, where they actually give you what they believe Hiram Powers was avoiding. Okay, in the figure of a laboring, enslaved, dark-skinned Black woman in America. So the other thing I want to point out here that occurs is that, of course, we have, through slavery in the ordering in a matrilineal, what we call a matrilineal order, meaning any enslaved child born to a Black female was an enslaved person at birth because the mother was enslaved. So you have an explosion of a mixed race enslaved population through that matrilineal organization. So what happens by the 19th century is that mixed race subjects become a topic of artistic inquiry in and of themselves. So you have paintings and sculptures called octoroon, quadroon, mulatto, etc., that are, we have to understand, stripped of their narrative potency because those women are Black and because those white artists do not feel they have to enshrine them with a narrative that explains why they are unclothed. Okay, to the same extent that Powers felt he had to do, in terms of a justification for the Greek slave to be unclothed. And of course, the justification is that she has not stripped herself. She has been stripped by the Turks who are about to auction her. Okay, so we want to think about at the same time the dominance of, or the rise of, the mixed race female subject, especially, and the lack of narrative. And why this is so important is that neoclassical sculptors were all about what? Art for morality's sake. This is way before art for art's sake. So everything needed a moral narrative, a moral underpinning. And we have here too a moment where many artists are invested in sculpting what? The unclothed human body. So they understand, though, in this moment of heightened, what we could call prudery, they need to justify why that enslaved subject or why that female subject or male subject is unclothed. And they did not feel, though, they had to do so to the same extent with a Black subject. So just to think through then these distinctions I'm talking about in the way that Black male subjects and Black female subjects are being sculpted. So getting close to concluding here, again, art for morality's sake, and Greek Slave is a huge example of that. And someone like Hiram Powers actually created the narrative and circulated the narrative before he exhibited the sculpture. And what I mean by that is he hired a man named Minor Kellogg to be his agent and tour the sculpture in the American South and North. And he circulated the sculpture at exhibitions with poetry and with narrative that describe what the viewer was supposed to see and how the viewer was supposed to read the work, okay? So we have to understand that the sculptures played a role in creating those contexts, okay? What I want to point out here then too is a work like Thal Palmer's White Captive. Again, there's a reason why this captive white woman has been rendered naked or have been stripped. And that reason is always for the white female outside of herself, and not so for Black female subjects, okay? So to go to this point is very important here. Neoclassicism, because neoclassical sculptors were so invested in anatomy and human anatomy, there's specific pathways of training that they had to go through. And the two dominant pathways were to draw from the nude in life drawing classes in art academies, and to learn from medical doctors by working with cadavers. We have to understand that the women we're talking about, Edmonia Lewis and the other women who were dubbed this, horrible name, the White Marmorean Flock, this was not a compliment. Most of them could do neither path through the institutions. So for people like Harriet Hosmer and people like Anne Whitney, how they acquired the medical anatomical training is that their families were upper class and they had access to private tutors from white male physicians. And Edmonia had no such pathway. So part of the thing that I like to consider with Edmonia is, and that we're still contemplating, how the heck did she teach herself human anatomy to be able to rise to the level she did and have the mastery of the human form that she ends up having? It's extraordinary. Because again, the white men, like a Hiram Powers, like a William Wetmore Story, no problem, both pathways completely open to them in terms of their class background, in terms of their maleness, and in terms of their whiteness. So again, just an example of how much this art was based upon human anatomy, okay? And then to think through who had access to that. So just briefly here, before I throw it over to Ramey, Edmonia Lewis, we don't have a definitive date of birth for her. She used to say anywhere between 1843 to 45, meaning she didn't know her date of birth. We know, thanks to the wonderful scholarship of Marilyn Richardson, that she died in London in Hammersmith in 1907. That's really interesting for me, that she did not go back to America, right? And America in, this 1900s, early 1900s and late 1800s was a mess for people of color, especially for people of African descent, due to the aftermath and the failure of Reconstruction after slavery. So it's really interesting to me that she did not choose to return to her own country. We know that she had set up her studio in Rome by the winter of 1866, because we have reporters commenting on her studio, her practice, and the artwork, the sculpture that she's beginning to make by March 1866. And there we have her passport application, which she files in Massachusetts. The first known work we have from her is from her time in 1862, when she was a student at Oberlin College. At the time that we know of, Oberlin was the only college in the USA where Black women and where any woman basically and Black people could study. So this is it for her. This was her one shot. And at Oberlin, we understand that she didn't actually have sculpting classes, but she was able to learn to draw and begin to express an interest in art. And this is the earliest artwork that we have of her, from 1862. Oberlin sadly ended disastrously for her, because she was accused of poisoning two white female roommates. She was tried for this accusation, and although she was acquitted, she was brutally beaten by a white mob, and luckily she survived. But she was acquitted, allowed to re-enroll in school, and then the administration basically barred her from graduating by accusing her of theft of art supplies. So it ended disastrously for her there, and she moved on to Boston, where we understand that is where she began to express an interest in sculpture specifically. So before I conclude, I just want to point out, though, when she makes her journey to Rome, and first she embarks on a bit of a grand tour. First of all, we have to understand there's, travelers and there's tourists. Edmonia was not of a wealthy class background. She was orphaned at a young age. The only family member we understand to have been supporting her was a brother who provided as much support, financial and emotional, as he could. We understand that Edmonia, like other Black people making the transatlantic crossing at the time, often were forced to cross in steerage, were denied cabins, whether or not they could afford them. Edmonia absolutely suffered indignities during that crossing, which she reported to Lydia Maria Childs. And we know this because of Childs' correspondence, where Lydia Maria Childs is commenting to other people about what Edmonia suffered on board during that transit. So we have to think about those discrepancies between someone like a Charlotte Cushman or Harriet Hosmer making the journey over on that ship, on those transatlantic ships, and Edmonia Lewis suffering through various racist indignities in order to embark upon her life's work as a sculptor. This is one of the places we know she had her studio. Why? Because Frederick Douglass visited her in the 1880s, and he documented visiting with her in her studios. Now, oh, to be a fly on the wall when those two were speaking, right? Frederick Douglass, enslaved, born into slavery in Maryland, self-liberated, goes on to be a statesman, a newspaper owner, a newspaper editor. There is one Frederick Douglass, my friends. Frederick Douglass wrote 3 autobiographies. Absolutely extraordinary and rare. Why? Because enslaved people were forced to be illiterate, so that he could leave slavery and then become literate and then become a newspaper owner, an abolitionist orator, is extraordinary. And of course, Edmonia had her own extraordinary path. So to think about what that looked like when they exchanged and shared on that would be extraordinary. Just quickly to point out, Edmonia, we know when she first got to Rome, was sculpting replicas of famous works to survive, right? To sell to tourists, so she'd have enough money to start her studio and maintain her studio. And we also know, of course, the other women around her that Ramey, of course, is going to speak to. Harriet Hosmer is present, and where we have documentation that Harriet Hosmer welcomed Edmonia, was supportive of Edmonia, and Harriet thought the world of Rome and what was possible in Rome and what was impossible in America. She says, I can do more and learn more here, meaning Rome, in 1 year than I could ever do in America in 10. And of course, thinking about the freedom of movement, mobility, freedom of intellectual curiosity, freedom to set up your own studio, freedom to live and pursue love and romance within same-sex bonds, freedom to reject heterosexual marriage, right? And we have to point out again, how extraordinary were these women? They were running their own studios, which means what? They had teams of artisans, mainly Italian men working under them, right? Doing the finishing touches in the marble on their conceptualizations, okay? And Harriet, of course, extraordinary in self-promotion. We know this through the letters and memoirs of Cushman as well. So she's very, very aware what it means for her to take up that space, okay? But just to think through some of those other women too who are there with them in this extraordinary moment. And just to remind us all, they were not a group in any sense of creating work together. They got lumped together as a group of women who were there on the ground at the same time, who are interested in what? Neoclassical sculpture. So they get lumped together to dismiss them by the likes of the author Henry James, who wants to describe them as what? Bird-like, meaning bird-brained, meaning not intellectual. And also Marmorean is a description meaning marble-like. Birds made of stone, of course, can't fly, meaning they're going to fall from the sky. So this was to make them look like they were a flock, meaning they were following each other randomly, and also that they lacked the intellect, lacked the capacity to do this art, okay? So we really have to put that moniker in quotes and understand that it's nothing that they adopted for themselves. And I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Ramey, over to you. So will you tell us a little bit about Margaret Foley?
Thank you so much. And thank you for that wonderful presentation, Charmaine. And it's just an honor to be here with you all, sharing in this fascinating topic that absolutely merits more study. So I hope this, germinates more thinking along these lines. I'm so glad that, Dr. Nelson mentions the fact that this is a loose group of American expatriate artists artists in Rome. It's not this like atelier or sort of group with a manifesto that they're all working towards the same goal or collaborating on projects necessarily. Each had their own path there, each had their own challenges or advantages that they were working through, and very distinct profiles. So I really appreciate that clarification for us. And I think, an interesting sort of cross current between Edmonia Lewis and Margaret Foley is just the great deprivations that they suffered in their careers, of course, to different degrees. Margaret Foley was a white woman hailing from northern Vermont, so she didn't have the racial landscape and landscape of racism and bias to navigate to that in the same way that Lewis did, but she was of immense poverty and came from basically, the most humble beginnings. And so I think it just, as we marvel at the work that these artists achieved, it's important to consider their particular trajectories. So I really appreciate Dr. Nelson mapping that for us for Lewis, and I'll try to do the same for Foley. And so Margaret Foley, as I mentioned, hails from humble beginnings in Vergen, Vermont. We believe she was born around 1827. Again, there's some uncertainty also about her birth date as well. She worked as a maid in order to afford school, and that covered her room and board. So just to give you a sense, she was working from a very young age to support herself. She later became a school teacher and worked in a mill in Lowell, Massachusetts. And she was among thousands of other young single white women from rural regions of New Hampshire and Vermont who were seeking employment in expanding factory towns at the time. And Foley first cultivated her sculpture practice as a cameo cutter, and her deft and elegant carvings in shell and lava earned her widespread recognition as a promising young artist by the mid-1840s. And it was her sort of cameo career that ultimately enabled her journey to Rome when she was in her 30s. And it was her reputation with her cameos that kind of caught the interest of various audiences in Massachusetts, and including a Vermont politician who sort of gathered funds to support that travel for her. And she left, to speak to Nicola's question about, what was the draw or the allure of Rome for American women artists at this time interested in a sculptural career. There was greater freedom, greater latitude in anatomical study, which, Charmaine mentions was so fraught for women during the Victorian era. And there was also greater access to quarries and foundries and all of the sort of infrastructure of working in stone that was not as established in the United States. And of course, that wonderful network of craftsmen, tradesmen, who could be employed to support some of the physical realization of these large scale works. So all of that sort of combined together, and then as more contacts were made, as more women put down roots in those in that environment, that also encouraged, others to follow, Foley included. And so Foley, we heard Dr. Nelson mention Charlotte Cushman. So she was accompanied by Charlotte Cushman, a Boston native and acclaimed Shakespearean actor, as well as Cushman's wife, Emma Stebbins, who was also a neoclassical sculptor, who invited Foley to share her studio. And Stebbins had previously studied under Maine-born sculptor, painter, and author Benjamin Paul Akers, whose iconic work, The Dead Pearl Diver, is a cornerstone of the collection of the Portland Museum of Art, where I work today. And so, my kind of entry point into this amazing art history, chapter of art history is through our acquisition on behalf of the Portland Museum of Art of this stunning marble medallion called Graziella, or the Capri Girl, by Foley, produced in 1868. And so I was, and we were thrilled to purchase this from Ben Elway's Fine Art in London this past summer. So this is a brand new acquisition. It will be on view very soon in our museum, but it's just opened up this floodgate of amazing considerations and sort of good, healthy jolts into our collection to think about, especially women artists more broadly in the 19th century and their foundational contributions to art history of the Americas and in this sort of broad transatlantic context. So of course, as a curator, I have to make a pitch for, why this particularly connects to our collection. And so this Emma Stebbins, Benjamin Paul Akers connection is how I was able to do so, other than just, of course, the immediate fact of the stunning facture and just sheer beauty of Foley's work in this particular roundel, which is so special. And I'll continue to delve into that shortly. But just to share with you all, so here is Benjamin Paul Akers, Dead Pearl Diver, in our collection. And this is a cornerstone of the Portland Museum of Art's collection. And it was the first purchase that was made by the institution in 1888. So it has a very storied history with us. It's an amazing object. I wish we had more time to talk about it today, but just wanted to share that. And so I was really keen to build out from Akers' legacy and how he was actually this important kind of node and mentor for so many of these women who found themselves in Rome, forging their own sculptural careers. And like I said, he was a particular mentor of Emma Stebbins, who Foley traveled with to Rome. So surely Foley met Akers or had some understanding of his influence while she was there. And I have this wonderful quote from Akers, who actually speaks of Stebbins and her talent. So this quote is, "My chief work now is a statue, which is perhaps one half modeled of a lost pearl fisher. My heart is in it. I have a pupil, a New York lady, Emma Stebbins, who will make New York proud of her. She and Miss Harriet Hosmer reside together, and we have our noon lunch in the studio." And so he is mentoring the circle of women at the very same time that he is making, and at work on the Dead Pearl Diver sculpture. So that's where I kind of found this great sort of just portal into this history that we could then think to build a richer story, a more dynamic and jagged edge story of neoclassical art that involves these women's contributions. And I love that, Akers was one of the very few men in this world who were not threatened by this amazing group of women. He welcomed them. He even permitted them to study from the nude in his studio, including Stebbins. And this was a very rare thing. Of course, there were more opportunities in Rome, but for Akers as an American artist to open that opportunity up to women pupils, that was a really kind of radical, progressive thing for him to do. So, this is something we can kind of celebrate and highlight and then continue to think more deeply about. And I just have some examples of Stebbins's work on the side. And I can conclude or start to conclude by just sharing a bit more about this fabulous roundel that we acquired and that has sort of sparked all of this thinking. The subject of this medallion is a young Italian model posing as a Capri girl who dons a headscarf and Etruscan revival jewelry. And this kind of jewelry accessory, in the Etruscan revival style is very much a telltale trope within Foley's broader of which often features very distinctive jewelry and accessories, that linked to fashioning of the self and an expression of the self in these portraits. It is the only extant work we know of to be signed by Foley with Capri. Often you see Roma, but to see Capri sort of delineated in text under the neck on the roundel is really interesting. And when speaking with Rachel and Ben Elways upon acquiring this work, they have speculated that it's perhaps, Foley was visiting the British journalist Henry Rayford there as he lived and entertained on Capri and was a supporter of Foley and other members of her circle, including Edmonia Lewis. So, that might be a nice link to where what would have brought her to Capri and maybe conjured this interest. But of course, Capri iconography was prominent during the second half of the 19th century. And you often see Capri women also in headscarves or other local garb emerging as a kind of archetype of Mediterranean beauty in works by artists like John Singer Sargent, which I have here, and Jules Joseph Lefebvre. And this 1878 painting in the Metz collection is also titled Graziella. And that name is the name of a heroine from Alphonse de Lamartine's popular 1849 book by the same name. And this story was quite popular. It revolved around the narrator's love for the beautiful daughter of a Neapolitan fisherman. Perhaps that is a literary reference for Foley's work. Again, unclear. I have not found her, waxing poetic about why she made this particular work, but, just thinking about that kind of broader cultural context offers some possibilities. And we think that it's possible that this work was commissioned by Cornelia Crowe Carr, a close friend of Harriet Hosmer, again, one of the earlier American women sculptors to work in Rome in the 1850s. And so, either way, this work exists at a kind of important nexus of relationships that really sustained Foley and her milieu. And, I just think that seeing the other popularities of these subjects, and again, that very striking profile, right? It's not in sculpture, but again, seeing that profile has all types of meanings and connotations, and that she's clearly kind of in conversation with. And I'm just looking at the time, Nicola. Should I pause there? Because I could certainly pause there if we wanted to kind of open it up. I have more I can share, but I also want to be mindful of letting this be a discussion as well.
Thank you, Ramey. That was fascinating. And gosh, yeah, I didn't know the Sargent and the Lefebvre. So I was just really, I thought maybe we could come back to two questions, which I think are particularly interesting. Well, one of them, both are of interest to me. One is something that Charmaine mentioned, this issue of white, neoclassical white. And because at the time, there were sculptors, mainly male sculptors, who were beginning to use polychromy, and they were using polychromy in the representation of women, and often of enslaved and Black women, whether of African descent in France or African-American in the United States. And it's interesting that I don't think any of these Harriet Hosmer or any of these other women actually even contemplated using polychromy. I mean, that was one thing I wanted to ask you about. And then the other was really how interesting it is that that we're kind of reintegrating these women into the canon. That in the last few years, how we've really begun to pay attention to people who've always been there and who we simply haven't given much attention to. So I just wondered if the two of you might speak to those two sorts of questions.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting about that point too is that the neoclassicists, they're so bizarre. It wasn't that they were totally against so-called polychromy. They were against it if it actually was a part of the materiality. And what I mean by that is when you go back and read the tourist literature around them in this mid to late 19th century period, and there was a ton of tourist literature, right? And there became staples like the Murray Guide, where they're writing about the ancient stuff that you're supposed to see when you're doing Grand Tour, and they're writing about, go to see Harriet Hosmer and go see William Wetmore Story, right? It's all in there. But in that tourist literature, they're writing about, for instance, parties that would gather and get up and go walk through and around the Colosseum specifically on moonlit nights. Why? Because they had the perception that the sculptures were coming alive, that they were breathing, that they were human. So that was one way that they want to animate the sculpture. Another way is Greek slave, for instance. Hiram Power installed it in 1851. How? Shrouded by a red velvet curtain. Why? Because the way that it was lit made the color of the red, right, cast onto the marble sculpture. And people talked about how it changed the woman to make her body look like she was a real white woman, like a biological white woman, meaning she had a complexion that was beyond idealized white marbleness, right? Okay, then there's other instances of famous sculptors being put in, for instance, in churches, I believe in Austria, where they were put specifically in the pathway of rose-tinted stained glass. Why? People would visit at the precise moment when they knew the light would come in, hit the rose-colored glass, and then tint the white marble, otherwise white marble, of the unclothed female body. So here you have the total hypocrisy of neoclassicists who wanted to feel and experience the specific complexions of, let's say, the white female body, but they wanted it to be external. So what they really hated was someone like John Gibson, who actually tinted the marble in his tinted Venus, and people loved it and they hated it, right? Or they really disparaged the contemporaneous polychrome practices centered in Paris by someone like Charles Cordier, where they'd actually use a bronze to convey the blackness of the African skin and use colored marble for the turban, for instance, in head of a Sudanese, for instance. So it's really a complex conversation around, it wasn't an outright hatred of polychromy. It was when color was actually a part of the materiality. That is what the neoclassicists were rejecting for some reason. And they had this hypocrisy, though, around the desire for color and animation, right? And biological specificity if it was external to the materials.
That's so fascinating. I know, I think we were speaking earlier too about, color, but also, the importance of anatomical study and how that was just this other locus of a lot of these frictions and tension points. And, how interesting it is that, Edmonia Lewis is able to produce spectacular, powerful works in the round, of the full human figure. But someone like Foley is not doing this to the same extent. It was really towards the end of her career, with one major commission for the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition, that she produces kind of figures in the round for this grand fountain design. And then she has a bust of Cleopatra, at the same time that Edmonia Lewis has her Death of Cleopatra on view there. But mostly it's these cameos or these medallions, these roundels of heads in profile. And it's just interesting to just think about how important paying attention to those details and what they denote about the social and political and context, and why that might be animating some of those choices or requiring or forcing some of those choices. So just to build on that, amazing discussion about color.
To your point too about like Foley, it seems you're saying she was doing more of the roundels or the relief works, and maybe avoiding the full human subjects that someone like Edmonia Lewis was doing, the sculpture in the round. Sorry, that's the word I'm searching for. To build on that point that you made, because it's so important that people understand. When I showed the image of Harriet Hosmer in the center of her artisans, we have to understand that was the typical practice. That's what all the white male sculptors were doing. They had teams of Italian artisans working in their studios to finish the different works that they were working on. So their focus went into what? The clay maquettes and transferring the clay into plaster. Handed over to the artisans. The artisans were doing most of the sculpting, and the sculptor who owned the studio would put the finishing touches on it. What we have to understand, though, in their fear of being accused of fraud, which Harriet Hosmer was accused of fraud in the sculpting of her quite famous work Zenobia in the 1850s, right? So, of course, white male sculptors said she didn't do her own sculpting, it was her artisans. She defended herself really well, writing a poem and writing an article in journals at the time. I think that's the same time period of her wonderful studio photograph. But we know that Emma Stebbins, again, wife of Charlotte Cushman, fired all her artisans. And Cushman wrote about how she was taking on this burden in a way that was killing her physically because she was terrified of being accused of not doing her own work. With Edmonia Lewis, we believe she didn't even ever hire artisans because she was so terrified as a Black and Indigenous woman of people saying she's not doing anything. So what we have to think about too is when you compare the oeuvre, the output of someone like a Lewis and a Stebbins to like a William Whitmore Story or Hiram Powers, they didn't make near as many sculptures. Why? Because they couldn't. Why? Because they didn't hire or they let go their artisans. So the other thing too is the literal output that they were able to do is minimal compared to what a white man like what William Whitmore Story, who was unafraid of any such accusations, of course, or an Ackers or Powers or Rastus Dow Palmer, because they could function in a world which assumed they had the intellect, the capacity, the physical ability to make sculpture, right? So what these women were up against then is the world that thought you don't belong here, you should be painting flowers in watercolor, right? So we have to understand how much, one, to be a woman in the 19th century and say, I want to be a sculptor, was just, people would lose their minds. They were like, what are you talking about? Because sculpture and neoclassical sculpture was so connected to a knowledge of the human body and so connected to the idea that you'd sculpt on the level, at least some works that were either monumental or life size in the round of unclothed bodies. So first of all, again, how are you going to get that training? And how, women were thought to be physically weaker. So how are you going to use the chisel and do that work? Okay. So we have to understand how just outside the box it was for these women to say, not just I'm going to do sculpture, but I'm going to do neoclassical sculpture, and I'm going to, just like the men, focus on human subjects. Extraordinary, right? And then the additional layer, as you pointed out, for Foley coming out of rural Vermont, like, come on, like, what did that take for her to even gather the means to make that trip to on the Grand Tour to establish herself in the room? Same thing as Lewis. Right? Lewis was totally dependent on her patronage to be able to do that. There was no family money backing her up. And that is why I'll just end here. That is why the criticism seems so harsh to us today of people like Anne Whitney and Lydia Maria Childs writing about, Childs is just, it's so latent with Indigenous and African stereotypes that they're leveling against Lewis. But Childs says at different moments, she doesn't think Lewis has any genius, meaning capacity for original creation. And she thinks that what she should be doing is just becoming a copyist, period. Okay, so they totally underestimated Lewis, and their support was always within the frame of, I will support you if you do what I tell you should be doing. So for Lewis even to think herself out of the limits of that so-called patronage and support is extraordinary. And a very important example of this is Lewis found out after the fact. She had sculpted portrait bust to sell at a Massachusetts fair during the Civil War of Robert Gould Shaw, who had died leading a Black infantry troop, I believe, right? The Massachusetts, a Black Massachusetts regiment. So he was lionized as this white man who had given his life for the cause of anti-slavery. So Lewis sculpts the bust. And Child, to her credit, bought one, okay, because there were multiples. This is part of how Lewis paid her way to Rome. She goes to Child's house to say goodbye. She sees that she's sawed off a piece of the chest and mounted it in a different way than she totally conceptualized. And she said to her, why didn't you tell me that? It looks so much better. I can take criticism. So it shows you too that like the people like Childs around her thought, oh, we can't say anything to her. She's going to fall on her face, but we have to support her anyway, because we can't be seen as abolitionists to not be supporting the Black sculptor. But what she wanted was people to say to her how she could get better, right? And that ends up in Child's correspondence saying, like, Lewis said to me, you should have told me, right? But also the betrayal there was that Child was really good friends with Robert Gould Shaw's parents, had photos of him, withheld them from her because she did not want Lewis's untrained hands to sculpt Robert Gould Shaw's form, right? So this is the kind of thing that Lewis was up against constantly.
Thank you all so much, and I hope to see you at another of our events soon. Goodbye.
Take care.
Bye.